When we look at a world map today, one of the most striking political anomalies is the relationship between Denmark, a small European nation, and Greenland, the world's largest island. How did this come to be? How does a country smaller than West Virginia maintain sovereignty over a territory 50 times its size, located thousands of miles away across the North Atlantic? The answer is a fascinating tale spanning nearly 8 centuries, involving Viking explorers, missionary zeal, colonial ambition, international legal battles, and evolving notions of self-governance. This is the story of how Denmark got to control Greenland. Our story begins over 1,000 years ago, in an era when Norse seafarers were pushing the boundaries of the known world. Around 986 CE, a red-haired Norwegian outlaw named Erik Thorvaldsson, better known to history as Erik the Red, sailed westward from Iceland after being exiled for manslaughter. What he found was a massive ice-covered landmass that he would shrewdly name Greenland, in a bit of medieval marketing designed to attract settlers. Erik the Red established the first European settlements on Greenland's southwestern coast in areas that were relatively habitable despite the harsh climate. These Norse communities grew over the following decades, with two main settlement areas emerging: the eastern settlement near present-day Qaqortoq and the western settlement near modern Nuuk. At their peak, these Viking colonies may have housed between 2,000 and 5,000 inhabitants. The Norse Greenlanders developed a unique way of life, combining farming and livestock herding with hunting seals, caribou, and walrus. They built churches, traded walrus ivory and polar bear pelts with Europe, and maintained contact with their Scandinavian homeland. For nearly 4 centuries, these Norse settlements represented Europe's westernmost foothold in the North Atlantic. But then, mysteriously, they vanished. By the late 1400s, the Norse settlements had been abandoned. The reasons remained debated by historians: climate change during the Little Ice Age, economic decline as ivory trade routes shifted, conflict with the indigenous Inuit population, or perhaps a combination of all these factors. Whatever the cause, by 1500, European presence in Greenland had effectively disappeared, and the island returned to being inhabited solely by Inuit communities. For more than 2 centuries, Greenland faded from European consciousness. The Viking settlements became little more than legends, their locations forgotten, their fate unknown. But the historical Norse presence would later become crucial in establishing Denmark's claim to the island. The renewal of European contact with Greenland came not from traders or explorers, but from a man of God with a missionary vision. In the early 18th century, Denmark and Norway were united under a single crown, ruled from Copenhagen. Hans Egede, a Norwegian-Danish Lutheran priest, became obsessed with the idea that descendants of the Old Norse settlers might still be living in Greenland, potentially having lapsed from Christianity or never having been exposed to the Protestant Reformation. Egede petitioned the Danish-Norwegian crown for support to mount an expedition to Greenland, both to find any surviving Norse Christians and to bring Christianity to the indigenous Inuit population. After years of persistence, he finally received royal backing. In 1721, Hans Egede, his wife Gertrude, their 4 children, and a small group of colonists sailed from Norway aboard the ship Hope. They arrived on Greenland's western coast and established a mission at what would become known as Godhop, Good Hope in Danish, now called Nuuk, Greenland's modern capital. Egede quickly discovered that no Norse descendants survived, but he dedicated himself to learning the Inuit language and converting the indigenous population to Christianity. This 1721 expedition marks the beginning of continuous Danish presence and influence in Greenland. Egede's mission received ongoing support from the Danish-Norwegian state, which saw an opportunity to reassert historical claims to the island based on the medieval Norse settlements. Hans Egede would spend 15 years in Greenland, establishing a foundation for Danish colonial administration that would last for centuries. Today, he's remembered as the Apostle of Greenland, though his legacy is viewed with ambivalence by many Greenlanders who see him as both a bridge between cultures and as a figure representing colonial imposition. Following Egede's initial settlement, Denmark moved to consolidate its position. In 1774, the Danish crown established the Royal Greenland Trading Company, granting it a monopoly over all trade with the island. This institution became the primary mechanism of Danish control, managing not just commerce, but also governance, administration, and settlement expansion. Throughout the 18th century, Danish settlements spread along Greenland's southwestern coast, while Dutch whalers occasionally operated in Greenlandic waters, creating some competition for influence. Denmark increasingly treated Greenland as an integral part of its colonial empire. The trading monopoly ensured that all economic activity flowed through Danish channels, and missionary work continued to expand Danish cultural influence among the Inuit population. The relationship between Denmark and Greenland was fundamentally transformed by events in distant Europe. The Napoleonic Wars that swept across the continent in the early 19th century would redraw the map of Scandinavia and determine Greenland's future. Denmark-Norway had allied with Napoleon's France, a decision that would prove costly. When Napoleon was finally defeated, the victorious powers imposed harsh terms on their allies. At the 1814 Treaty of Kiel, Denmark was forced to cede Norway to Sweden, ending a union that had lasted over 4 centuries. This could have been the moment when Greenland's fate diverged from Denmark's. Norway could potentially have claimed Greenland based on the Norse heritage of the original Viking settlers, but the treaty specified that while Norway went to Sweden, Denmark would retain its North Atlantic possessions, Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands. Why did Denmark keep Greenland when it lost Norway? Several factors played a role. First, Denmark had been the dominant partner in the Union and had administered these territories directly through Copenhagen. Second, the recent re-establishment of settlements and the Royal Greenland Trading Company had created clear Danish institutional presence. Third, and perhaps most importantly, these islands were seen as colonial possessions rather than as intrinsic parts of Norway. The great powers negotiating the treaty were not particularly concerned about the fate of distant, sparsely populated Arctic and Atlantic territories. They were redrawing the map of Europe itself. From 1814 onward, Greenland's political destiny was firmly tied to Denmark alone. Over the following decades and into the 20th century, Denmark administered Greenland as a colonial possession, maintaining the trading monopoly and restricting access to the island. This isolationist policy was partly paternalistic, intended to protect Inuit culture from disruption, but it also ensured complete Danish control. By the early 20th century, as international law developed and Arctic territories gained strategic importance, Denmark's control over Greenland would face its most serious challenge, not from a distant power, but from its Scandinavian neighbor. In the 1920s and 1930s, Norway, which had gained full independence from Sweden in 1905, began to look northward. Norwegian hunters and trappers had been active in eastern Greenland, an area that remained largely unsettled by Danes. In 1931, Norwegian nationals raised their flag over parts of eastern Greenland, claiming the territory for Norway. The Norwegian government, under pressure from nationalist groups and economic interests, officially annexed the eastern portion of Greenland in 1932. Denmark was outraged. The dispute threatened to poison relations between the two Scandinavian nations, but rather than resort to force, Denmark chose the path of international law. The case was brought before the Permanent Court of International Justice in The Hague, the predecessor to today's International Court of Justice. The 1933 legal proceedings became a landmark case in international law regarding territorial sovereignty. Denmark argued that it had continuously administered Greenland since the 1721 re-establishment of contact, that it had exercised sovereign functions throughout the island despite sparse settlement in the east, and that Norway had recognized Danish sovereignty through various treaties and diplomatic interactions over more than a century. Norway countered that eastern Greenland had never been effectively occupied by Denmark, that Norwegian citizens had been the primary European presence in that region, and that historical Norse settlement gave Norway a competing historical claim. The court ruled decisively in Denmark's favor. The judgment emphasized that sovereignty over a territory doesn't require settlement of every square mile, particularly in areas as vast and inhospitable as Greenland. What matters is the display of sovereign authority and the intention and will to act as sovereign. Denmark had demonstrated this through its administration, its laws, its treaties with other nations regarding Greenland, and its continuous presence since 1721. The 1933 ruling was a watershed moment. It provided Denmark with unambiguous international legal recognition of its sovereignty over all of Greenland. No nation has seriously challenged Danish sovereignty since. But even as Denmark's legal control was confirmed, the nature of that control was about to undergo dramatic transformation. World War II brought significant changes to Greenland's status. When Nazi Germany occupied Denmark in 1940, Greenland was effectively cut off from Danish administration. The United States, fearing German bases in the Arctic, established a military presence on the island with the permission of the Danish ambassador in Washington, acting independently of the occupied Danish government. This wartime experience gave Greenlanders a taste of greater autonomy and exposed them to the outside world in unprecedented ways. After the war, pressure mounted for Denmark to modernize its relationship with Greenland. The era of European colonialism was ending, and the old paternalistic system seemed increasingly anachronistic. In 1953, Denmark enacted a constitutional amendment that fundamentally changed Greenland's status. The island was no longer a colony, but was integrated into the Kingdom of Denmark as a county, with Greenlanders becoming full Danish citizens entitled to vote and representation in the Danish parliament. This integration brought significant investment in infrastructure, healthcare, and education, raising living standards considerably. But it also accelerated cultural change that many Greenlanders found disruptive. Danish became the dominant language in education and administration. Traditional ways of life were discouraged in favor of modernization. Fishing villages were consolidated into larger towns. Thousands of Greenlandic children were taken from their families to be educated in Denmark in a program that would later be seen as a tragic mistake. By the 1970s, a new Greenlandic political consciousness had emerged. A generation of educated Greenlanders began advocating for greater control over their own affairs. They argued that while integration had brought material benefits, it had come at the cost of cultural identity and self-determination. The movement toward home rule gained momentum. In 1979, following a referendum in which Greenlanders voted overwhelmingly in favor, Denmark granted Greenland home rule. This transferred authority over internal affairs, including education, health, social services, and resource management, to a new Greenlandic parliament and government based in Nuuk. Denmark retained control over foreign policy, defense, and the justice system, but Greenlanders now had substantial autonomy. Home rule was just the beginning. Over the following 30 years, Greenland's government gained experience and confidence, and calls for even greater autonomy grew. In 2008, Greenlanders voted again, this time on expanded self-governance. The result was overwhelming, over 75% in favor. The 2009 Self-Government Act marked another milestone. It recognized Greenlandic as the official language, transferred control over natural resources to the Greenlandic government, gave Greenland authority over its police force and coast guard, and expanded judicial authority. Most significantly, the act recognized Greenland as a distinct people with the right to self-determination under international law, including the right to independence. Today, Greenland occupies a unique position in international relations. It is an autonomous constituent country within the Kingdom of Denmark, similar to the relationship between the Cook Islands and New Zealand, or between the Netherlands and Aruba. Greenland has its own parliament, its own government, its own flag, and control over most internal affairs. Yet it remains part of the Danish realm, with Denmark responsible for foreign policy, defense, and currency. So how did Denmark come to control Greenland? The answer is layered and complex. It began with Norse explorers in the 10th century, establishing the first European settlements. When those settlements vanished, Denmark's ancestor state, Denmark-Norway, reasserted claims in the 18th century through missionary work and colonial settlement. When Denmark and Norway split, Greenland stayed with Denmark through historical circumstance and treaty arrangements. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, Denmark administered Greenland as a colonial possession, receiving international legal recognition of its sovereignty in the landmark 1933 court case against Norway. But the story doesn't end with colonial control. The mid to late 20th century saw a remarkable transformation from colony to county to autonomous territory, driven by changing global attitudes toward colonialism and by Greenlandic demands for self-determination. Today's relationship is one of partnership rather than subjugation, though debates continue about the balance of power and the path toward possible independence. The question of Greenland's future remains open. While Denmark maintains formal sovereignty, Greenland exercises extensive autonomy and possesses the recognized right to independence. Economic considerations, particularly Greenland's heavy reliance on Danish subsidies that cover about half the government budget, complicate the independence question. Climate change, opening new shipping routes and revealing mineral resources, adds new dimensions to Greenland's strategic importance and economic potential. What's clear is that Denmark's relationship with Greenland has evolved from Viking exploration to colonial possession to a modern partnership based increasingly on Greenlandic self-determination. It's a story that spans 8 centuries, from Erik the Red's pioneering voyage to today's debates about Arctic sovereignty and indigenous rights. The journey from medieval Norse settlements to 21st century autonomy reflects not just how Denmark came to control Greenland, but how that control has been gradually transformed into something far more nuanced, a relationship that continues to evolve in our changing world.